The dense jungle lay quiet, the trees towering above like silent guardians. Birds chirped overhead, their calls echoing through the air, while the ground below remained untouched, except for the soft rustling of leaves. Deep within the forest, a white tiger family had settled, the mother laying in the cool shade, her large body still but her eyes wide with concern. She had always been strong, agile, a protector of her cubs, but now she lay injured, her once powerful limbs failing her. Something had happened, perhaps a predator or a hidden snare, and her strength had faltered. She needed help. Her cub, small and bright-eyed, observed her from a distance, sensing something was wrong. The cub had inherited her mother's keen instincts, but her heart, too, was filled with worry. The mother was their protector, their source of survival, but now she needed saving. The cub circled her mother, nudging her gently with a soft paw, but the older tiger only groaned in response, unable to rise. The cub's eyes darted around the jungle, trying to comprehend what could be done. She knew that no amount of nudging would bring her mother back to health. Something had to change. The young tiger was clever. Her mind was sharp, and though small, she understood the world around her better than most would give her credit for. Her sharp gaze flicked back to her mother, who winced with each shallow breath. The cub looked at the dense forest surrounding them, but this time it seemed different. There was an urgency now, a feeling that the forest wasn't enough. She needed to leave it. She needed to find help. But who could help a wild tiger? And who could get past the dangerous world of the jungle to reach them? The cub watched as her mother's breath slowed, her body weakening, and an instinct began to rise in her. She needed to go beyond the forest. She had heard stories from other animals. The animals who had ventured far from the jungle. There were humans far outside their home. Perhaps they could help. It was a risk, a leap into the unknown, but she knew that without help, her mother's life might slip away. The cub didn't hesitate. She turned and began her journey through the thick undergrowth, her small paws cutting through the terrain with determination. Her journey wasn't easy. The dense foliage of the jungle provided no path, and every step seemed to challenge her. Fallen branches blocked her way, and unfamiliar sounds echoed in the distance. She paused only for a moment before pushing forward, driven by a singular purpose. Her muscles burned from the effort, and the humid air of the jungle clung to her, but she didn't stop. She had to keep moving to find help before it was too late. As she traversed deeper into the forest, the cub encountered dangers at every turn. A wild boar charged past her, its tusks narrowly missing her body. A hawk circled above, watching her every move. But none of these distractions slowed her down. She was on a mission. She needed to find someone, something that could help her mother. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but she ignored it, the sense of urgency overwhelming her. Hours passed, and she grew tired, her small body now aching from the relentless journey. She paused near a stream, resting only for a moment before lifting her head. In the distance, a figure appeared. The cub squinted, unsure of what she was seeing. Human. She had heard of them, but she had never seen one. Her eyes narrowed, sizing him up from a distance. He was young, perhaps not much older than a teenager, and moved with a quiet purpose through the forest. He wasn't like the predators of the jungle. His presence didn't exude the same menace. No, he seemed different. The cub's curiosity flared, but doubt also settled in her mind. Would he help her? Would he understand the gravity of her mission? She had no way of knowing, but the mother tiger's condition was worsening, and there was no time to waste. The cub made her decision. She crept closer, her paws silent on the earth, inching toward the man. She paused, watching his movements, studying him like a puzzle she was trying to solve. He seemed unaware of her presence, absorbed in his own thoughts, but the cub didn't give up. She let out a soft sound, barely audible, but enough to catch his attention. The young man stopped and turned, his eyes widening when he saw the cub standing just a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them moved. The man's gaze held confusion, then something else. Recognition, perhaps. The cub wasn't an ordinary animal. She was different. He could see that. But what did she want? The cub didn't hesitate. She took a few steps closer, lowering her head slightly, showing no aggression, only the urgency in her eyes. She glanced back toward the jungle, then back at the young man. He seemed to understand the silent plea she was making. The cub's gaze was clear. It wasn't just a tiger looking for food or a fight. She needed help, and he was the only one who could provide it. He studied her for a few moments longer, processing what he had just seen. His hand moved to his side, instinctively reaching for something. Perhaps a weapon, perhaps to protect himself. But then he stopped. He saw the cub wasn't a threat. Her eyes, pleading yet intelligent, told him everything he needed to know. He nodded. It was a subtle gesture, but it was enough. The cub turned immediately, leading the way, trusting this stranger to follow her. The jungle wasn't a place of kindness, but somehow she had found a human who was different. This man, this stranger, might be the answer to the question she had been asking herself for hours. The cub led him with a silent confidence, her heart racing but her paws steady. The journey back to her mother had begun. The cub led the young man through the dense undergrowth, her small body moving with an urgency that seemed to match the increasing speed of his steps. The distance between them and the injured mother tiger grew shorter with each passing minute. The man kept pace, his eyes darting around, cautious but also intrigued by the situation. It was clear that the cub wasn't just lost or curious. There was something more to this encounter. She wasn't leading him on a random trek through the jungle. She was guiding him toward a purpose. The cub's senses were sharp, her movements confident despite the strain of the journey. Her ears flicked at every sound, her eyes scanning ahead, calculating the safest route. The man, though experienced in navigating the forest, struggled to keep up with her pace. His boots crunched against the leaves and twigs, disturbing the natural quiet, while the cub's paws remained silent. She was a creature of the wild, perfectly attuned to the rhythms of the jungle, and she knew exactly where she was headed. As they neared the location, the air grew heavy, thick with the scent of the jungle's undergrowth and the sharp tang of fresh earth. The cub slowed, her steps growing more deliberate. Her heart raced as she sensed the mother's presence nearby. She could smell the familiar scent of her mother's fur, but there was an underlying sharpness to it, the scent of injury, of weakness. The cub's mind raced, knowing that she had done all she could. Now it was up to the young man. They reached the clearing, and the cub paused just before entering, her body tense with anticipation. She darted into the open, moving swiftly toward her mother. Her presence immediately recognized by the older tiger. The mother lifted her head weakly, her eyes narrowing as she saw the cub return, but the confusion was evident in her gaze. She had no strength to growl or defend herself, but the protective instincts were still there. The young man approached cautiously, unsure of what to expect. He saw the injured tiger lying in the dirt, her body battered and bruised. The cub circled her mother, her tail flicking nervously as she glanced between the man and the tiger. She knew the situation was delicate, and any sudden movement could cause her mother to lash out in fear or pain. The young man knelt down, trying to appear non-threatening. He studied the tiger's injury carefully, an obvious wound to her side, blood staining the fur around the gash. The sight of it made his stomach twist. He wasn't a doctor, but he knew enough about wounds to recognize the danger of infection. He had to act quickly. The cub watched him intently, her eyes searching his face for any sign of hesitation. There could be no hesitation here. There was no room for error. The man didn't flinch. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small bundle of herbs, a mixture he had learned from his travels. He had seen animals in similar conditions before, though never a tiger. This was new, but his instincts told him to keep moving. His fingers moved quickly, preparing a poultice of crushed leaves and bark. The cub observed, silent and still. She didn't understand the specifics of the herbs, but she trusted him. With a deep breath, The young man approached the mother tiger. He could feel her gaze on him, a mix of suspicion and fear, but he had no choice but to continue. Gently, he placed his hands on her wound, applying the poultice with care. The mother growled faintly, her body shuddering, but she made no move to attack. She was weak, and the pain from her injury seemed to outweigh the need for defense. The cub watched, her heart pounding in her chest, hoping that the young man's actions would bring some relief to her mother. As he worked, the young man muttered to himself, calming both the tiger and the cub with his steady voice. His hands were careful, his movements deliberate as he patched up the wound as best as he could. He could feel the weight of the moment, the life of the mother tiger in his hands. The cub paced nervously, her small form twitching with each sound, her gaze never leaving the scene. She was trusting him, believing in his ability to heal. The mother's breathing grew steadier as the poultice began to take effect. The pain didn't vanish, but the man could see a shift in her expression. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Once the wound was tended to, the young man sat back, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. He had done what he could, but it wasn't enough to guarantee her survival. The tiger needed time, rest, and more care than he could provide on his own. The cub stepped forward, her body still tense but hopeful. She looked up at the young man, her gaze filled with gratitude and trust. He met her eyes, understanding the weight of his actions. After a moment, the young man stood up, taking a step back. He glanced around the jungle, as if searching for something, before looking down at the cub. She was still by her mother's side, standing guard, as if waiting for his next move. The cub wasn't done yet. She had trusted him to help, but she knew they couldn't stay here forever. Her mother needed rest, but she also needed to be hidden from the dangers of the jungle. The young man nodded as if understanding the cub's unspoken thoughts. It wasn't over. They weren't safe yet. He motioned for the cub to follow him, and the two of them began to move slowly and quietly, away from the clearing. The mother tiger remained where she was, her breathing slow but steady. The cub stayed close to her mother for a moment, before following the young man into the thick jungle once again. They moved through the jungle in silence, the only sound being the soft rustle of leaves beneath their feet. The cub, though exhausted, remained determined. She wasn't about to leave her mother's side. She would protect her no matter the cost. The young man, too, was resolute. He had helped in the only way he knew how, and now it was up to time and the jungle to decide what would happen next. By the time they reached the outskirts of the forest, the young man knew it was time to leave. He had done what he could, and the cub had led him as only she could. He glanced back one last time, seeing the silhouette of the mother tiger standing strong once again. The cub watched him with a silent understanding, their bond now unspoken but clear. With a final glance, the young man turned and began walking away from the jungle. He had made a difference, however small, in the life of a wild creature. The cub, now alone with her mother, watched him leave, knowing that the forest would continue to be their home. But for a moment, the jungle had been a place of trust and teamwork. And that was enough.